I remember the exact moment it all began. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon. I had just come back from running errands, carrying a bag of groceries and thinking about nothing more stressful than what to make for dinner. That's when I saw it, a crisp envelope sitting on my porch. It wasn't just any envelope. The logo in the corner read HOA, and my heart sank immediately. I set the groceries down and picked up the letter, noticing the neat, almost too perfect handwriting of the HOA secretary. I opened it slowly, as if savoring some sort of suspense movie. The first line made me pause. It has come to the attention of the HOA that your fence may be encroaching upon the property of your neighbor, Karen. I stared at the words for a long moment, half expecting it to blur into nonsense. Karen, my neighbor, my seemingly harmless neighbor who smiled at me whenever we met in the driveway, the same Karen who brought zucchini bread to our block party last summer. She was claiming that my fence was on her property. I laughed nervously at first, thinking it had to be a mistake, maybe a mix-up. Surely the HOA had made an error. But as I read further, the tone of the letter left no room for misunderstanding. It was formal, precise, and aggressive in the way only an HOA can be. They demanded that I remove the fence within 2 weeks or face fines that would accumulate weekly. 2 weeks. To tear down an entire fence, possibly move it back several feet and then rebuild it. My mind was already racing with questions. How could this even be true? I had built that fence years ago, making sure it stayed within my property lines. I had the receipts, the permits, everything. I decided the logical next step was to just breathe. Maybe Karen was mistaken, maybe there was some misunderstanding, maybe the HOA just wanted to scare me into compliance. But there was something in the phrasing of the letter that made me pause. They weren't asking, they weren't suggesting, they were ordering, and there was a smug tone behind it that I could almost hear, as if Karen herself had written the words. I walked around the yard, staring at the fence. It looked exactly the same as it always had. The wood hadn't shifted, the post hadn't moved. Nothing had changed since the day I built it, and yet, according to this letter, it was now a trespass. I couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread. This was more than a fence dispute, this was personal. I went inside and poured myself a cup of coffee, hoping that the warmth would calm my nerves. I replayed every interaction I'd had with Karen over the years. There had been that time she told me my mailbox was too close to the curb, and the time she complained about the color of my shutters. Small things, yes, but looking back, they felt like little warning shots. And now this, an all-out assault on my property. I couldn't help but shake my head and mutter under my breath. This is insane, absolutely insane. But part of me knew that once the HOA got involved, things rarely went back to normal. They had a reputation for siding with the loudest, most insistent neighbor. And Karen, well, she had the kind of confidence that made you wonder if she'd been plotting this for months. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter, trying to figure out my next move. Call the HOA, hire a lawyer, move the fence preemptively and hope for mercy? I felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and a strange sort of fascination. How far would Karen go? How far would the HOA back her up? I didn't know it yet, but this letter was just the beginning of a long, frustrating, and at times ridiculous battle. And as I stared at the words on the page one last time before putting the letter down, I felt it. The subtle, creeping feeling that my life, my yard, and even my sanity were about to be tested in ways I had never imagined. Little did I know that this fight would last years, and the truth would take an even stranger turn than any of us could have expected. After staring at that letter for what felt like hours, I decided I couldn't just sit there and stew. I had to confront Karen. Not angrily, not sarcastically, but calmly, with the hope that maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. I brewed a fresh cup of coffee, took a deep breath, and walked over to her house. I rang the doorbell, and there she was, standing on her porch like a queen surveying her kingdom. She wore that same self-satisfied smile I had seen countless times, the one that somehow made you feel small without her even saying a word. I tried to appear friendly. Hi, Karen, I just got the HOA letter, I began. I wanted to talk and see if we can figure this out. Her smile didn't waver, in fact, it widened. Oh yes, she said, her tone dripping with confidence. I knew this fence would be a problem eventually. I've been watching it for years, and it's definitely on my property. She waved her hand at me as if the invisible boundary lines were crystal clear. I blinked. Watching it for years? I asked, struggling to keep my voice calm. I mean, I built this fence according to my permits and the property lines. Surely there's some mistake. Karen laughed lightly, like I had just told the world's worst joke. Mistake? No, I know my property, I know my lines, and the HOA will back me up on this. Her words were precise, deliberate, and designed to sting. I felt my cheeks flush. I tried again, taking a step closer and gesturing to the fence. Maybe we can measure it together. I can show you my documents. I just want to resolve this without, fines or legal headaches. Her expression didn't change. I don't need to see your documents. I know what's mine and that fence is not. She crossed her arms and leaned slightly to the side like she was ready to pounce if I challenged her. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but I also wanted to cry. This was my property, my home, and yet here I was being lectured by someone who apparently had turned measuring imaginary property lines into a full-time hobby. I realized then that reasoning with Karen wasn't going to be simple. She wasn't misinformed. She was deliberate, strategic, and frankly ruthless. I backed off slightly, trying to regain my composure. Okay then, I said slowly. I guess we'll have to bring this to the HOA board. Maybe they can help settle this fairly. Her eyes lit up and I immediately regretted suggesting it. Oh yes, I'll be presenting my case. They'll see the truth for themselves. She smiled at me again, but this time it wasn't neighborly. It was triumphant. She seemed almost pleased that she had managed to rope the HOA into her side. As I walked back to my house, coffee cooling in my hand, I couldn't help but think about how ridiculous this all was. A fence. A simple wooden fence which I had painstakingly built myself had somehow become the battlefield for Karen's self-appointed neighborhood crusade. I shook my head and muttered under my breath, 2 weeks, that's how long I have. Once inside, I spread out my old property documents, permits, and maps across the kitchen table. Every line, every measurement, every corner was documented. I had proof. But would it matter? Could paperwork and logic really stand against Karen's relentless confidence? The thought made me uneasy. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes. Karen would linger near my property when she thought I wasn't looking, waving her phone as if she were taking notes. She began dropping subtle comments whenever we ran into each other. I hope the HOA takes this seriously. We all need to respect property lines. The passive-aggressive tone was almost comical, but it was also maddening. I realized that this wasn't going to be a quick conversation or a simple meeting. This was going to be a battle of persistence, patience, and perhaps even cunning. Karen wasn't just looking out for her property. She was playing a game, and I was suddenly a piece on her board. By the end of that week, the reality hit me hard. The HOA board meeting was approaching, and I had no idea what kind of war I was walking into. Karen was confident, prepared, and clearly relishing the chance to make me look foolish. I just hoped I could stand my ground and prove that my fence and my rights were entirely legitimate. Little did I know, that meeting would be more intimidating than anything I had faced. And it would push me further into a world of HOA rules, fines, and neighborly drama that seemed far too absurd to be real. The day of the HOA board meeting arrived faster than I expected, and I was already on edge. I tried to prepare myself mentally, but nothing could have braced me for the sight that awaited. The boardroom felt more like a courtroom than a community meeting space. A long, polished table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by chairs for the board members. The walls were lined with pictures of the neighborhood's best-kept lawns, a subtle reminder that everyone here took rules very seriously. I walked in, clutching my stack of documents, property permits, surveys, photographs, all meticulously organized. I was ready to present my case logically, calmly, and politely. I hoped that reason and facts would prevail. Karen, of course, was already there. She stood near the center of the room, holding a clipboard, her face glowing with a kind of smug satisfaction that immediately made my stomach twist. She had brought props, or what she called evidence. A hand-drawn map of my property, lines crooked and measurements questionable at best, marked with what she insisted were intrusions. I felt a surge of disbelief. She had actually prepared a slideshow complete with colored markers and arrows pointing at my fence like it was some criminal suspect. I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. This was absurd, yet somehow the board seemed impressed. When my turn came, I stepped forward, spreading my documents on the table. I'd like to clarify the property lines with official documents, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. These permits and surveys show the fence has been entirely on my property since it was built. Karen interrupted almost immediately. Those documents mean nothing. You clearly don't understand property lines. I've lived here for years and I know exactly where the boundaries are. She gestured dramatically at her hand-drawn map as if that alone should carry weight. I took a deep breath. With all due respect, Karen, I have permits from the city and prior surveys. These are legal, official records. The board members nodded politely, but their faces didn't betray much emotion. They listened, but it felt like they were weighing how much they liked Karen personally rather than listening to the facts. I started to feel a knot in my stomach. This was going to be harder than I thought. Karen launched into her presentation with gusto. She pointed at each part of the fence, describing imaginary encroachments with meticulous detail. This post is clearly over the line. This section is pushing into my lawn. You can see it if you just measure it. Her tone was theatrical, almost like she expected an audience gasping at every revelation. The board members murmured among themselves, occasionally nodding, which only fueled her confidence. I tried to respond calmly, showing them each official document. Here, the city's survey. Here's the permit approval. Every corner of this fence is exactly where it should be. The measurements are clear and legally binding. Karen scoffed. The city doesn't know what they're talking about, only I do. She glanced at the board, and I swear I saw a few of them lean forward as if she were presenting irrefutable evidence. I clenched my fists under the table. This wasn't about facts anymore. It was about power, control, and who could dominate the room. The meeting dragged on. Karen's theatrics, the board's polite nods, and my desperate attempts to stay calm made every minute feel like hours. I could feel my confidence waning, wondering if all the permits in the world would matter against her relentless insistence. And then came the vote. I held my breath as the board members whispered among themselves, glanced at Karen's map, and finally one by one raised their hands. It was unanimous, against me. I sat there stunned, my documents still spread in front of me, feeling like the room had tilted sideways. My fence was declared an encroachment. I had 2 weeks to tear it down or fines would begin to accumulate. 2 weeks. The absurdity of it all made me want to laugh, but all I could do was sit there quietly, feeling the first real pangs of helplessness. Walking home that day, I felt a mix of disbelief, frustration, and dread. Karen smiled at me from her porch across the street, waving in a way that made it clear she considered herself victorious. I wanted to scream, to argue, to prove her wrong right then and there, but I knew that wasn't the end. Somehow I had to fight back. I couldn't just let this slide. This wasn't only about a fence anymore. It was about standing up for my property, my rights, and my sanity. I just didn't know yet how I was going to do it. Little did I know, this board meeting was only the beginning. The next steps would pull me deeper into a world of fines, passive-aggressive neighborly attacks, and the slow realization that Karen would not stop until she got exactly what she wanted. And I had no choice but to prepare for the fight of my life. After the board meeting, I thought things might settle down. I was wrong. Almost immediately, the consequences of Karen's victory began to appear in the form of fines. The first invoice arrived a few days later, slipped neatly under my door like an ominous warning. I opened it and stared in disbelief. $200, a fine for having my fence encroach on Karen's property. My stomach sank and a slow anger began to bubble. Within a week, more fines followed. They kept stacking, each one accompanied by a note reminding me of the 2-week deadline. I tried to reason with the HOA over the phone, but every call was met with vague assurances and a polite but firm reiteration that the board had made its decision. Karen, of course, was having the time of her life. I started noticing her subtle maneuvers around the neighborhood, her presence always just on the edge of my property line, always seeming to inspect my yard when she thought I wasn't looking. It didn't stop at the fence. Suddenly, Karen began reporting every minor infraction she could find. The grass was too tall, she said, even though it was the same height it had been for years. One gutter had a leaf stuck in it, and she insisted it violated HOA standards. The paint on my mailbox, faded and unacceptable, she wrote in one particularly dramatic email. Each report felt more like a personal attack than a genuine concern for the neighborhood. At first, I tried to laugh it off. I'd shake my head and mutter under my breath, "This is ridiculous, she's losing it." But as the days went on, the fines piled up and the constant emails and complaints started to weigh on me. I felt trapped like a character in some absurd sitcom that had somehow crossed into real life. Every time I stepped outside, I felt Karen's eyes following me, calculating, measuring, judging. It was exhausting. I started to document everything. Each fine, every email, every passive-aggressive note. I wanted a record of her behavior in case things escalated further. Still, it felt surreal. How could a single neighbor, armed with nothing more than complaints and a self-assured attitude, make my life so stressful? One afternoon, while dealing with yet another fine over an imaginary property violation, I saw Karen standing across the street talking to another neighbor. She waved at me, a perfect picture of civility, but there was something in her smile that made me uneasy. It wasn't friendly, it was triumphant. She had successfully turned a simple fence into a full-blown neighborhood feud, and she clearly enjoyed every minute of it. The pressure of the escalating fines forced me to start thinking strategically. This wasn't going to be a matter of pleading or hoping someone would intervene. Karen had control of the narrative, and the board seemed more inclined to listen to her confident assertions than to consider the evidence I had presented. I realized that if I wanted to protect my property and my sanity, I needed something stronger, something undeniable. Late at night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the growing pile of invoices and letters. My mind raced with possibilities. Could I find a professional surveyor to measure the property accurately? Could I gather proof that would finally shut Karen down? The thought gave me a glimmer of hope. I wasn't powerless. I had legal documents, permits, and my own observations, but I needed someone officially recognized to back them up. By this point, Karen's obsession had become almost theatrical. She seemed to take pleasure in reporting the smallest details as if she were slowly wearing me down. I had to admit it was effective. It was exhausting, demoralizing, and yet somehow motivating. I knew that if I let her continue unchallenged, the fines would keep coming and the harassment would never end. I also realized that this wasn't just about the fence anymore. Karen's actions had escalated into a full-scale campaign of intimidation. Every report, every fine, every phone call was a reminder that she could make life difficult if she wanted to. I had no choice but to fight back strategically, with proof, patience, and a plan that would withstand her relentless attempts to bully me. That night I made the decision. I would hire a professional land surveyor. I would get accurate official measurements. I would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that my fence was on my property. It felt like the first step toward reclaiming control. Little did I know how long it would take, how complicated it would become, and how much Karen would escalate her antics before the truth finally came to light. After weeks of mounting fines, passive-aggressive letters, and what felt like constant surveillance from Karen, I finally realized I couldn't rely on logic or polite conversation anymore. I needed hard, indisputable evidence. That's when I decided to hire a professional land surveyor. I figured if anyone could put an end to this madness, it would be someone with official tools, credentials, and the authority to measure property lines accurately. The process began with a call to a local surveying company. I explained the situation, trying not to sound desperate, though I probably failed. The receptionist was sympathetic, almost amused, as if these kinds of HOA disputes happened all the time. They scheduled an appointment for the following week, promising that the surveyor would come out, check my property, and produce an official report. The day of the survey, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The surveyor, a professional in his mid-40s named Tom, arrived with all the equipment you'd expect: tripods, laser measurers, GPS devices, and a clipboard full of maps. He greeted me politely, listening patiently as I recounted the entire saga with Karen and the HOA. I could see him suppress a small smile at some points. He'd obviously heard plenty of ridiculous property disputes in his career. As he set up, Karen appeared, almost like she knew this was the perfect opportunity to make a spectacle of herself. She stood across the street, arms crossed, watching every move. "I hope he knows what he's doing," she called out, her voice dripping with condescension. I swallowed hard, trying not to react. Deep down, I wanted to shout back, but I knew this was a battle of evidence, not shouting matches. Tom began by walking the property line, marking precise points, measuring distances, and cross-referencing them with official records. He explained each step to me in detail, which helped calm my nerves. "We're going to get the exact measurements and boundaries," he said, "no room for interpretation." I felt a small flicker of hope. Finally, there was someone on my side who couldn't be intimidated or swayed by Karen's theatrics. Karen, of course, didn't give up. She wandered closer, peering over the fence, muttering under her breath. At one point, she asked if Tom was certified enough to measure property lines, as if she could somehow invalidate years of experience with a casual question. I bit my tongue and reminded myself to stay focused. This was the proof I needed, and nothing Karen said could change that. The survey took several hours. I watched nervously as Tom measured every corner, double-checked each line, and compared his results with city records. I took notes and pictures, knowing that documentation would be crucial later. By mid-afternoon, the results were ready, or at least the preliminary findings. Tom handed me a rough map showing the boundaries in bold lines. My eyes widened as I traced the fence's location. It was exactly where it should be, every corner, every post, perfectly within my property lines. My relief was immediate, but also mixed with a sense of vindication. Finally, there was something concrete to counter Karen's relentless claims. I wanted to run across the yard and shout it out, but I held myself back. This wasn't over yet. The official report would be what truly mattered to the HOA. Karen, noticing my reaction, gave a sharp laugh. "We'll see what the HOA says," she called. Her tone was triumphant, as if she had already imagined herself victorious no matter the results. I felt a surge of determination. This was my chance to stop the madness, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate the truth any longer. Over the next few days, Tom finalized the survey report. It included detailed measurements, GPS coordinates, and legal documentation verifying that my fence was entirely on my property. I read through it again and again, almost in disbelief. After months of harassment, fines, and stress, I finally had proof that could not be ignored or twisted. The next step was clear. I had to present this evidence to the HOA and prepare for the inevitable confrontation with Karen. I knew she wouldn't go quietly, but now I had something she couldn't argue with. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control. I wasn't just a homeowner being bullied. I had facts, legal proof, and a surveyor who could back me up. As I set the report aside and looked at my fence, I realized something important. This fight was about more than property lines. It was about standing up to relentless intimidation, protecting what was mine, and showing that persistence and evidence could overcome even the most stubborn opposition. And though I knew the next few weeks would bring tension, confrontation, and perhaps more ridiculous antics from Karen, I felt ready. For the first time, the tides had turned in my favor. The moment I received the official surveyor's map, I felt a strange mix of relief, disbelief, and excitement. After months of harassment, fines, and endless arguments, the truth was finally in my hands. I spread the document across the kitchen table and traced the bold lines with my finger, double-checking every corner, every boundary. The fence, it had always been on my property. Every measurement, every corner, every post was exactly where it belonged. I couldn't help but let out a small laugh, part of me wanting to dance around the kitchen. All those weeks of stress, all the fines, the meetings, the passive-aggressive glances from Karen, it had led to this moment. Finally, there was hard evidence that I could use to fight back. But that excitement was tempered by caution. I knew Karen wouldn't accept the truth easily. She had been relentless from the start, and I had no illusions that presenting this map to the HOA would be simple. She would argue, object, and attempt to twist facts to suit her narrative. I had to prepare myself mentally for her next move. The surveyor's report was thorough. It included not only the exact property lines but also official GPS coordinates, legal annotations, and photographs marking the precise location of every fence post. This wasn't just a sketch or a personal opinion, it was an official, legally recognized document. I could see it clearly. Karen's claims were baseless. The fence had never crossed her property. I decided to share the findings with a few trusted neighbors first, just to gauge reactions. Their responses ranged from shock to amusement. One neighbor chuckled, "She really went that far over a fence?" Another shook their head, saying, "That woman never gives up, does she?" Their reactions made me realize something important. While Karen had created the illusion of authority, the reality was that most people could see the truth if it was presented clearly. Even with that reassurance, I knew the real battle would be with the HOA. I scheduled a meeting to present the report formally. The next few days were tense. Every time I saw Karen across the street, she gave me a calculating look, a smile that said she wasn't done yet. I knew she was planning her next move, and I had to be ready. When the meeting finally arrived, I brought the surveyor's report, copies for each board member, and extra sets for myself. Karen, predictably, was there, armed with her hand-drawn map and an air of confidence. She didn't seem concerned at all, as if the surveyor's report would somehow vanish in the face of her certainty. I could feel the tension in the room as everyone settled in. I started by calmly explaining the process Tom, the surveyor, had followed. I showed them the official map, highlighting the exact placement of the fence. I detailed how measurements were taken, verified, and cross-referenced with city records. As I spoke, I noticed Karen's smug expression faltering slightly. She tried to interject, claiming the surveyor might be biased or mistaken, but her objections sounded weaker than usual. The board members examined the map closely, flipping through pages, checking coordinates, and comparing them with the HOA's own records. I watched carefully as the reality of the evidence started to sink in. This was more than just a diagram, it was proof. Hard, undeniable, and legally binding proof that my fence was completely on my property. Karen grew flustered. Her usual confidence wavered as she realized that her claims were being dismantled piece by piece. She pointed at her hand-drawn map, trying to argue, but the board members shook their heads politely, refusing to engage with inaccurate, unofficial sketches. For the first time, I felt the power shift in my favor. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. The evidence was irrefutable. The board members acknowledged that my fence had been properly placed all along. Karen's objections, her theatrics, her years of intimidation, it all crumbled under the weight of facts. I felt a rush of vindication. Finally, after years of frustration, the truth had emerged. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't give up quietly. She was the type who might sulk, appeal, or find another way to create chaos. But at that moment, standing there with the official surveyor's map, I realized something powerful. Persistence, evidence, and calm determination could overcome even the most relentless opposition. I wasn't just defending a fence. I was standing up for my rights, my home, and my peace of mind. And as I walked out of that meeting, map in hand, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The next step would be dealing with Karen directly, and this time I had the ultimate weapon, truth. The tide had finally turned, and for the first time in years, I felt like victory was within reach. After the surveyor's map had revealed the truth, I thought I could finally breathe. But I quickly realized that Karen wasn't about to let go without one last fight. She was persistent, stubborn, and completely convinced that she could twist reality to suit her narrative. The next HOA board meeting was approaching, and I knew it would be the ultimate showdown. I arrived early, armed with copies of the official surveyor's report, photographs, and my own notes. Each item was carefully organized because I had learned the hard way that preparation was everything when facing Karen. I wanted to present everything clearly and calmly, leaving no room for argument. Karen, predictably, was already there, standing near the entrance, clipboard in hand, and that same self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face. She gave me a long, slow look, the kind that made it clear she thought she was going to win again. I ignored it and focused on the task at hand. The meeting began, and as the board members settled in, Karen started her speech. She waved her hand-drawn map, pointing at imaginary encroachments with exaggerated gestures. "This fence is clearly on my property," she said, her voice dripping with authority. "I have been monitoring this for years, and this is the truth. The board must recognize it." I took a deep breath and waited my turn. When I spoke, I presented the surveyor's report in a calm, measured voice. I explained how Tom, the surveyor, had measured the property lines with precision instruments, cross-referenced the results with city records, and produced a legally recognized map showing the exact placement of my fence. I laid out photographs, documents, and annotations that left no room for doubt. Karen's smug smile began to falter. She opened her mouth to argue, but the board members were already studying the report. One member raised an eyebrow and asked a question about the GPS coordinates, which I answered confidently. Another flipped through the report and nodded toward the measurements, clearly impressed by the level of detail. It was surreal watching Karen try to regain control. She pointed at her map, trying to distract the board, but her arguments sounded weaker with each passing second. She even misquoted a lot number at one point, which earned a quiet chuckle from me and some barely suppressed murmurs from other attendees. Her theatrics were crumbling, and the board could see it. As I continued, I emphasized that the fence had always been on my property, that all permits had been obtained legally, and that the surveyor's report was objective and professional. I didn't need to raise my voice or make grand gestures. The facts spoke for themselves. The board members conferred quietly, glancing at Karen, then at me, and then back at the official documents. The tension in the room was palpable. Karen's confidence had vanished, replaced by visible frustration. She tried to interject again, but the chairperson politely reminded her that the discussion would follow the evidence, not assumptions. Finally, the vote was called. I held my breath as each member raised their hand. One by one, they voted in my favor, unanimously. My fence was confirmed to be on my property, the fines would be rescinded, and Karen's claims were officially dismissed. I felt a surge of relief and vindication wash over me. Years of harassment, stress, and sleepless nights were finally coming to an end. Karen's face fell. She sputtered, tried to argue, and even raised objections about minor details in the survey, but the board had clearly made up their minds. She stormed out in a huff, muttering under her breath, and for the first time, I felt the victory was truly mine. Walking home, map and documents in hand, I felt a strange mix of triumph and disbelief. This had been a long, exhausting journey, and yet the satisfaction of finally standing up to Karen and proving the truth was indescribable. I knew she might sulk or try something petty in the future, but I also knew that with the surveyor's map in hand, her attempts to intimidate me further would be futile. That day, I learned something important. Persistence, preparation, and patience can overcome even the most stubborn opposition. Karen had thought she could manipulate the HOA and bully me into submission, but the truth had a way of catching up. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had reclaimed not only my property but also my peace of mind. I couldn't help but smile to myself. The fence was mine. The fines were gone, and Karen, for all her confidence, had been exposed. Victory had a sweet, quiet satisfaction, and I was ready to enjoy it fully, fence intact and sanity restored. After the board's unanimous decision, I thought I could finally relax. The surveyor's report had done its job, the fines were rescinded, and my fence was officially recognized as being on my property. For the first time in years, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I could walk around my yard without worrying about an accusatory glance from Karen or another unexpected letter from the HOA. But as with all things involving Karen, the drama wasn't completely over. True to form, she lingered in the background like a storm cloud, hoping to find another way to stir up trouble. I noticed her whispering to neighbors, her eyes darting toward my property, clearly trying to find a new angle. I reminded myself to stay calm, facts were on my side now, and there was no need to engage her theatrics. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. A few neighbors who had witnessed Karen's relentless campaign began approaching me quietly, offering words of support. One mentioned that they had suspected all along that her claims were exaggerated, but seeing the official survey confirmed what they already believed. Another said they admired my patience and persistence. It was a subtle kind of victory, but it meant more than I expected. I realized that sometimes, standing up for the truth also earns respect from those around you. Then came the most satisfying part, Karen's reaction. She tried a few minor complaints, petty, insignificant things, but the HOA ignored them, clearly aware that her credibility had been damaged. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by frustration and occasionally awkward silence when neighbors refused to entertain her claims. It was almost comical to watch her attempts fizzle in real time. After months of harassment, the tables had completely turned. One afternoon, I decided to take a slow walk around my property, soaking in the quiet triumph. The fence stood exactly where it had been for years, solid and unshakable, just like my patience and perseverance. I remembered the countless letters, the fines, the tension-filled board meetings, and even Karen's smug smiles. And now all of that felt like a distant memory. The truth had prevailed, and my property and my peace of mind were intact. I also took a moment to reflect on what this ordeal had taught me. First, persistence matters. I could have given up at any point, ignored the fines, or tried to compromise just to avoid conflict, but standing firm, documenting everything, and seeking professional help had made all the difference. Second, evidence is powerful. Karen could act confident, loud, and intimidating, but facts cannot be twisted indefinitely. The surveyor's map had spoken louder than any argument, email, or meeting. And finally, I learned the importance of patience. The battle with Karen had been long, draining, and at times infuriating, but rushing or reacting emotionally would have only played into her hands. Waiting, documenting, and carefully planning each step allowed me to reclaim control without compromising my integrity. In the end, the neighborhood felt calmer too. With Karen's claims officially dismissed, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Conversations became less tense, interactions with the HOA more routine, and I felt a renewed sense of confidence walking past my yard every day. It was almost like a weight had been lifted, not just for me, but for anyone else who had silently endured her drama over the years. One afternoon, as I watered my garden near the fence, I caught sight of Karen across the street. She looked flustered, muttering under her breath while glancing at my property. I smiled to myself, shaking my head. It was tempting to wave, to gloat, or even to shout, "I told you so," but I didn't. This victory was quiet, personal, and sweet. I had reclaimed my space, my rights, and my sanity, and that was far more satisfying than any confrontation. Years from now, I'll probably still remember that wooden fence and the ordeal it caused. What started as a simple property dispute turned into a lesson in persistence, patience, and the power of undeniable evidence. Karen had tried to intimidate, manipulate, and exhaust me, but in the end, truth won out. My fence remained where it belonged, my fines were gone, and the neighborhood had seen firsthand that even the most confident opposition can be undone by preparation, professionalism, and calm determination. As I stood there enjoying the sunlight on the fence, I realized something. Sometimes the smallest battles, like a simple wooden fence, can teach the biggest lessons. And victory, when it comes from standing firm and doing what's right, tastes better than I could have imagined. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.